Hello, everyone. Thanks for being here. My name is Catherine. I am an AmeriCorps service member with the Vermont Land Trust. My role is education and outreach coordination, which was supposed to look a lot like school programming, and now it's a lot online programming. So we're doing the best that we can. Today we have a tree ID webinar that is family focused, and we have Ethan Tapper here. He is a Chittenden County forester, and it's very exciting. This is my first online live webinar, so be patient with me because I'm going to be managing the Q&A, and then I'll pass it off to Ethan to do the content. So if you have questions, put them in the Q&A box. You should see it at the bottom of the window here, and we'll save time for questions at the end. So I think that's everything.
Great. So my name's Ethan Tapper. I'm the Chittenden County Forester. County foresters are these foresters who work for the state Department of Forest, Parks, and Recreation. And we do all kinds of different stuff, mostly focused on helping Vermont landowners figure out how to manage their land in a responsible way. And during this time, I'm trying to do all kinds of ways to reach out to you and give you more information about the woods and how to take care of it. And so with that, I'm going to start this presentation. Like Catherine said, there will be time for questions at the end of the presentation. And if you have questions, just pop them in the chat box. You can see the bar at the bottom of your screen. There'll be a chat icon. Click on that and put them in there, and we will try to answer as many as we can at the end of the presentation. And so here we go. So we're calling this course Tree Identification for Beginner Naturalists. And so basically this is an idea, it's a simplified version of the tree identification course that I would normally do, which would be much more complicated, targeted at people who are just getting started and kids. And so I normally call this course Identifying Common Trees in Vermont. And I really want to stress here that partnering with the Vermont Land Trust, which I'm really excited about, we partner together on all different kinds of things with Catherine and Angie. And so the idea isn't to give you all the information about all the trees in Vermont, but just some common ones to help you when you're going through the woods. And so one of the amazing things about learning to identify trees is most people, when they walk out in the woods, they just see like trees, right? And then you start to learn what they are, and you go, oh, these trees are all different species, and they all sort of behave in different ways, and they all look different and sort of have a different character. Now, there's about 50 native species of Vermont, of trees in Vermont, but the top 10 most common species, which are listed here on this screen, account for almost all of them. So if you're out there in the woods with your tree ID book and there's a gajillion different species of trees in that book, you don't need to learn all of those. I would focus on these 10, and you'll have like almost all of the tree species in Vermont. And so the other thing I want to think about is you don't need to know also every single characteristic about these trees. What you can do is just learn these like big important characteristics. And what that will do is help you identify them. And then as you get more familiar with the tree species, then you can learn more about them and learn all of the different sort of nuances of like their personality and how to identify them. So white or paper birch, it's either called white birch or paper birch, it's the same tree, is a really good example of this. So there's all these different characteristics. They have leaves, and they have twigs, and they have buds, and they have flowers, and all these other different things. But most people can identify white paper birch just from the bark. So paper birch or white birch, and I'll use those interchangeably, it has white peely bark. It peels in these big sheets. You guys have probably all seen this. Peels in these big sheets. It's called paper birch because those bark sheets are like big sheets of paper. If you've walked through the woods in Vermont, you've probably seen this. It's striking because it's the only tree that's really white, and it's the only tree with these big sheets of bark that are peeling off it. So really all you need to identify paper birch is the bark. The bark is also really good for starting fires. If you guys have ever started campfires, it makes an amazing, amazing fire starter. And it's waterproof. So native people used to use it for all different kinds of things, including making birch bark canoes out of. So white or paper birch, focus on that white peely bark and you'll get there. So the cousin of paper birch is yellow birch. Yellow birch has a lot of the similar characteristics. So basically you can just focus on the bark, just like white birch, except for the bark, instead of being white and peeling in these big broad sheets, is like metallic and golden and peeling in these thin little papery sheets. It's really shiny. I should mention both yellow birch and white birch have these like horizontal dashes on their bark. They're called lenticels, but you don't need to know that. You just need to know that they look like these horizontal dashes. So they both have that, but you can tell between them because yellow birch bark will be golden and metallic, white birch bark will be white, yellow birch bark will be peeling in these thin little strips. Paper birch or white birch bark will be peeling in those big papery sheets. There's also another interesting thing. That's what yellow birch looks like when it's young. A couple other interesting things about yellow birch. If you scratch the twigs, like if you get a twig and just scratch the bark with your thumb and smell it, it will smell like mint, like wintergreen. And so sometimes if you just have a twig and you don't know what it is, and maybe it's a young one, if you scratch and sniff and it smells like mint, it's yellow birch. The other thing that I say about yellow birch is that it grows legs and it does dance moves. So this picture on the screen is an example of that. And actually what that is that yellow birch is really good at growing on rotten wood. So let's say a tree falls over in the forest or a tree's cut and there's a stump. A yellow birch seedling will start growing on that stump and it will put roots down around that stump, and then the stump will rot away, and so it'll leave, those roots will be exposed and it'll leave it looking like it has legs. Now this is a tree species that you've probably all heard of a lot, but it's identifying it in the woods is a little bit harder. Sugar maple. So the bark of sugar maple, so we've been focusing on these peely barks. The bark of sugar maple is more sort of craggy and rough. And even when they're a young tree, it'll look warty. And so it'll have these just little like pock marks. If you run your hand up and down it, it'll just feel rough and like there's like warts on the bark. And then when it gets older and the bark gets older, it'll become more what I would call platy. So having these big, broad plates of bark. Sometimes the bark will also have this whitewashed appearance. So if you see the picture on the screen there, you'll see that there's like a big splash of white down the side of the tree. And sometimes when you're looking through the woods, you can start to pick out sugar maples just based on that whitewash, that sort of splash of white paint appearance on their bark. One thing that's really important to know about sugar maple is that the bark, while it will break up into these and be broken up into these sort of vertical plates when it's older, it'll never be shaggy or peely. So you shouldn't ever be able to like pop a piece of the bark off with your thumb. In telling sugar maple from its cousin red maple, that's a big difference because red maple has very thin bark and can be very shaggy and peely, and you can easily just sort of rub your hands up and down the tree and pop pieces of bark off. And with sugar maple, you should never be able to do that. So they have these sort of iconic leaf shapes. So you guys have probably all seen the shape of this leaf on all kinds of maple syrup containers and all kinds of Vermont products and stuff like this. Sugar maple has what's called a palmate leaf. And you can remember that because it's like the palm on your hand. And all that means is that there's a central point, which is right here in the center of the leaf. And from that, the veins of the leaf, these lines coming out from that center point, go off in a bunch of different directions. So it's like the fingers coming off from the center of the palm of your hand. And sugar maple has 5 major points on that leaf. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You can also see that this area right here, this is called a sinus. It's the area between these 2 big lobes. The sinus of sugar maple is shaped like a U. And that's like the U in the word sugar. The other thing that you can identify sugar maple from is that a lot of times in our woods, you'll see these big, huge, open-grown trees. And when I say open-grown, what I mean is that when a tree normally grows in the woods, what they'll do is they'll put most of their energy into growing upwards, and because they're competing with their neighbors for light, reaching for the sunlight, and so most of the branches will be up in the top of the tree pointing upwards. Now, in the case of in case of trees that are grown in the open, those branches will spread out and stretch out like this, stretching out sort of horizontally because there's no other trees that are competing with them. Many sugar maple trees, when Vermont was mostly cleared for agriculture in the 1800s, sometimes they left these sugar maple trees in the field. So they would be trees that would be for shade for livestock like sheep and cows. And then also they would sugar them in the springtime. And so there's these huge old trees that are now scattered around our forest. The forest has regrown around them from those former pastures, and they're really striking. They just look like these amazing ancient trees growing in a way that's unusual to all the other trees in the forest. And so here are some pictures of what that can look like. So you probably have recognized trees that look like this in the woods. And when trees are growing like this in your woods, they're usually sugar maple. Another tree species that is really, really common in Vermont is white ash. So white ash, the best characteristic for telling white ash is its bark. And so a lot of these other barks, remember, so we have the birches where their bark is peeling into these horizontal strips or sheets. Sugar maple, where the bark is warty and rough, or breaking up maybe into these sort of vertical plates and maybe having that whitewashed appearance. White ash bark is it's like looking at a pattern on a rug or something like that. It's this very symmetrical, regular pattern of these very thin bark ridges, which sort of seem to like make this interlocking diamond shape appearance. It's very, very regular, and it just sort of has this sort of snake skin or interlocking diamond appearance, and the bark will be symmetrical all the way around the tree. And so with many of these other trees, the way that the tree sort of breaks up and becomes shaggy or becomes rough or becomes peely or platy will be sort of irregular, and it'll look different on one side of the tree than on the other side of the tree. With ash, it'll be the same all the way around the tree. Right now, you're not going to have access to buds. So a bud is just what the trees carry in the wintertime, which becomes their leaves and their flowers and their twigs later in the year. But for most of the year, when we don't have leaves, we have these buds. And this bud at the very end of this twig is called a terminal bud. And that's just on the end of every twig, a tree species will carry a terminal bud that often looks different than these buds on the side, which we call lateral buds. The terminal bud, if you have an ash twig, the terminal bud looks like a chocolate chip. If you see that, it's this brown chocolate chip shaped thing on the end of every twig. I also often say that ash trees have fat fingers. And all that means is that their twigs are a lot thicker than the twigs of all the other trees. So if you look up, especially when there's no leaves, you look up into the canopy, you'll see all these other tree species will have these very fine, intricate networks of twigs, and ash will just sort of have these clumsy looking fat ones. In the summertime with their leaves, they have lots of these little leaflets. And that to me looks like bamboo leaves. It's like a jungly kind of appearance when you look up into the canopy of the ash tree, which is just lots of little leaves. And here's an example of those sort of fat fingers. So you can see that to the right here, we have, I believe that's an American beech tree over here. And with many fine little twigs. And then here's the ash with these big fat fingers. It's opposite branched, which just means that here's a branch and then twigs come up opposite one another across the branch. And the end of the branches look like a bird's foot. So they have the perfect, here's, one little claw, another little claw, and here the front claw of like a chicken foot or something like that. And those just really fat fingers. Moving on here, American beech. So American beech, I learned as having very smooth skin like very smooth bark like elephant skin. So it's the only tree species that we have that the bark should be completely smooth. And it's this beautiful, smooth, gray bark. Sometimes you can see like initials that have been carved in it from like 30 years ago, and they're still legible, which is pretty amazing. Unfortunately, it's also afflicted with an invasive disease that was introduced in the early 1900s called beech bark disease. So while you'll still see patches of smooth bark, a lot of times that smooth bark will have these black pockmarks or cracks in it, which is a symptom of that beech bark disease. Here's another example of a bud. So again, right now you won't be able to tell these buds, but later by the end of the summer, they'll be fully formed buds like this. I always learned this bud, which is longer and thinner and pointier than any other bud that you're gonna see, looks like a cigar that a mouse would smoke. You see that? Even with like, it looks like this perfect little cigar for a mouse. And again, it's longer and thinner and pointier than any other bud you're gonna see, so that can be a really good characteristic for identifying beech, even when they're young. Beech also has a distinctive leaf trait, which is that, so here's the leaf, and we talked about veins on a leaf. Basically, this is just like a center vein, and these are just some side veins or lateral veins. If you follow these lateral veins to the margin of the leaf on beech, each vein ends in a single tooth. So at the end of each vein, there's just this little out-jutting tooth right here. And there's a lot of different tree species that have serrations, like all these tons of teeth or a jagged looking leaf margin. But beech is the only one where each vein ends in one tooth. They also have these really cool spiky beech nuts, which bears really like, and turkeys and deer and everything. That's what they look like when they break apart, and there'll be 2 or 3 beech nuts in there. And sometimes you'll see beech trees that have bear claw marks. So that's a tree that's a beloved bear tree. And that's just, all those little scrapes are just marks from the bear's claws as they climb up these trees. Bears really like beech trees, and they'll actually go back to the same beech tree year after year after year and visit it and teach their young to climb on these same beech trees. And so you can walk through the woods, and sometimes there's no bear claw marks in any beech trees, and then you'll just find one that's just covered in them. It's just sort of just an important bear beech tree. And in the wintertime, young beech will hold on to their leaves, and they'll get dry, and they'll rattle around. And so you'll be able to see them because it'll be the only tree in the understory of the forest which will have all hanging on to all these leaves, and then you'll hear that dry rattling sound. So with that, I think I'm going to skip red oak for now, and just let you know some of my favorite identification books. There's this book, A Beginner's Guide to Recognizing Trees of the Northeast by Mark Michaelis, which is really great. I also really like the book Bark, A Field Guide to Trees of the Northeast by Michael Wotek. And with that, here's some upcoming events that the Vermont Land Trust is putting on. Wildflowers in the Woods on the 19th, Exploring Wetlands from Lakeshore to Summit on the 20th, Restoring Vanished Landscapes on the 3rd, and on the 12th, Among Grassland Habitats. And you can visit the Vermont Land Trust website at vlt.org to learn more. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen and take some of your questions.
Okay, I saw a really good question from someone named David. Hello, David. He was wondering, when you were showing the yellow birch towards the beginning, it had the stump that had died and then the yellow birch growing on top.
Yeah.
He wants to know, will that tree use the stump as a nutrient source?
Yeah, absolutely. So yellow birch as a species, it really likes to grow in like disturbed soils and in rotting wood, just because it has this little seed. The seed isn't good at penetrating like this deep layer of what we call duff, which is just all these rotting leaves and needles and stuff like that. And so, yeah, when it's a young tree, it'll basically be like eating that stump and living off that stump, and it will continue to live off the organic material and the nutrients that are in that stump for a long time. You can actually sometimes tell in a forest, you'll have like a bunch of yellow birch that are all the same size, and they're so linked to soil disturbance. So when the soil gets scuffed up, or rotting wood, that a lot of times the fact that there's a bunch of, say, 30-year-old yellow birch in your forest means that 30 years ago your forest was logged, or there was a big wind event or something else that either stirred up the soil or caused there to be a lot of rotting wood on the ground.
Cool. Thank you. That was a great question from David. Another question from someone named Glenn: do certain birds like certain trees, woodpeckers, for example, and if you know of any others?
Yeah, I mean, there's all kinds of, and I work with Audubon all the time, so I don't have to be as sharp on my bird stuff as I maybe should be. But Yeah, there's all kinds of really interesting associations between bird species and specific trees. Like, for instance, aspen poplar is thought to be a really important tree species to woodpeckers because their wood is softer and the woodpeckers can excavate these cavities in them. And then the woodpeckers themselves are this sort of keystone species because they create all these cavities, these holes in the trees when they're pecking, looking for grubs and insects that are in the tree. And those holes are utilized by like all different species of birds and mammals, like flying squirrels. And if they're really big, stuff like owls, will use those. I know that a lot of our native bird species will, especially the ones that are still here in the winter, will eat like lots of teeny little soil or bark invertebrates, like little insects and little spider eggs and stuff like that. And for some reason on yellow birch, the diversity of the insect life on yellow birch is like really high. So they're a species sometimes if we're trying to manage for like holistic bird habitat health, we'll be managing for yellow birch just because we know that those invertebrate populations are so important for yellow birch, just the amount of insects on that tree. But there's a lot of them. These forests are systems, and all these different tree species are kind of doing something different and offering a different thing to wildlife. So they're all really, really important.
Cool. Great question. Thank you, Glenn, for that question. Okay, Sarah wants to know, are there any other trees other than sugar maple that can be used as a food source? That's an interesting question.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of them. And so like indigenous people to Vermont used all kinds of stuff. Acorns from red oak and white oak and bur oak and swamp white oak and our other oaks. Mostly red oak because that's what we have the most of. But yeah, you can eat beech nuts. You can eat acorns. They're bitter, and you have to leach the tannins out of them to make them really edible. At this time of year, I know that young basswood leaves are like a really good salad green. Yeah, there's all kinds of different uses, and people also tap yellow birch and white birch. And even beech and some of these other species, people are starting to like do experimental tapping to try and make like beech syrup, which is really interesting.
Cool. Yeah, I recently saw birch water at the store.
Mm-hmm.
I haven't tried it, but I need to.
Yeah, I think it's catching on. Oh, and the other one I would say that's big is hickory nuts. Hickory nuts are really good to eat.
Oh, cool. Cool. Thanks for that question, Sarah. David has another question. He would like to know, what is the role of fire in Vermont forest? He said he's from out west and fire seems to be different here. And I actually was doing a different AmeriCorps service term in Wyoming before this. And I remember seeing a lot more like wildfire out there than I have here. So I would love to know that too for my personal experience. Thanks, David.
Yeah, and traditionally Vermont's forests are called the asbestos forest because they're considered like unburnable, but there have historically been big burns, especially in New Hampshire. There were these big, basically they're clear cutting the sides of the White Mountains and created these conditions to create these massive fires. And every year in Vermont, there are fires. They're either from lightning strikes usually or from human activity. Okay. And we do have ecosystems that are linked to and actually dependent on fire. So fire is like a normal part of these ecosystems. And we have tree species like pitch pine, which are actually like really need fire in order to be healthy. And so in some of these places, like in my county, on some of the lands owned by the Department of Defense, they're doing these like really innovative burning to basically create this or to recreate the dynamics of fire on what's called a sand plain forest, which is a forest that would have burned regularly. And so I'm here in Burlington. Burlington used to be an example of a sand plain forest that would have burned relatively regularly. And so I think that we know that fire had some impact on our landscape, but not as like a large scale, catastrophic, big disturbance like it is out west, probably more as like something that would happen frequently and at a low intensity. And we know that Native people also did some burning here as well. But that said, our climate is changing and it might become a bigger impact on our landscape depending on the way that shakes out.
Cool, thank you. Thanks for that question, David. Susan wants to know, what are the names of planted trees that line the entranceway to Shelburne Farms? Very specific. I like it. They have somewhat shreddy bark and branches reach for the sky. This is really testing your specific.
Yeah, because I actually used to, so when I was in college, I used to work at Shelburne Farms.
Oh, cool.
I used to work with the draft horses, which was really fun. I'm trying to remember what those trees would be. I know that they've got a lot of like bur oak out there. Shreddy bark, like, so if you're thinking about shreddy bark, the most common planted tree that would have shreddy bark that you can see like all through our towns, really, really shreddy, peely bark, is silver maple. A lot of times silver maple will be growing. It'll be like a low stump, and then, 3, 4, 5, 6 feet off the ground, it'll break up into these huge lateral trunks. And then it could also be bur oak, but I don't know. I can't remember off the top of my head exactly what that would be.
Well, that was a good start to an answer. So thanks for that question, Susan. Ethan wants to know, where did the invasive disease in the birch tree come from?
Oh, in the beech. Yeah. So beech bark disease is a complex. It's one of these species. So when you introduce a species from somewhere else into a new environment, basically different species of trees and plants and animals and even like fungi and bacteria and diseases, if they've been in the same place for a long period of time, they've evolved together. So they've learned how to deal with each other, and one thing will develop a trick and the other thing will sort of develop a trick to deal with that trick, and it'll be back and forth and back and forth. But what happens with these invasive diseases basically is that you completely remove the influence of evolution by just putting them in a new place where nothing else has ever seen that before. And so I think it came in on European beech, planted European beech trees. So European beech had a version of the fungi that is part of beech bark disease for a long time and just could deal with it. It just wasn't a big deal. But American beech had never seen that. And so it was introduced to Nova Scotia, or first noted in Nova Scotia like in the 20s, I think, and then has since sort of spread from there downwards.
Cool. Thank you, Ethan, for that question. Okay, there are so many good questions coming in. Wow. Let's see. Glenn again wants to know, where and what are the oldest trees in Vermont?
I think so. There are many trees in Vermont that are capable, tree species that are capable of living for a really long time. Unfortunately, we have this legacy of, in the 1800s, like 80% of Vermont was cleared for agriculture, which is pretty amazing to think about. And so we lost a lot of our really old trees. But the oldest trees that we have in Vermont are probably white cedar. White cedar is a species of trees that grows in swamps, and it also grows on like lakeside bluffs. So if you're in Burlington and you go out to like Rock Point or some of these other areas overlooking the lake, you'll see there's like these cliffs and there's these little tiny like wizzled cedars on them, which will sometimes be hundreds and hundreds of years old. There's also oaks are certainly capable of living many hundreds of years old, 5, 6 plus 100 years old. But probably if I were to guess, I would guess that the oldest tree in Vermont right now is a white cedar, and that it's, it could be 500 or 600 years old.
Wow. Cool. Thanks for that question, Glenn. Let's see. I'm going to get to some of the ones that came in from Facebook. So Angie told us that Emily from Facebook wants to know, does carving into beech trees harm it?
Yeah. Yes, please don't do it. So basically, like, the bark of a tree is this like really important layer that seals the inside of the tree from the outside. And anytime there's a break in that bark, that's an opportunity for stuff to come in that could hurt the tree. So like bacteria and fungi and insects and all of these things, as soon as you scuff off a piece of that bark, the trees are able to heal from that to some degree, but it's definitely exposing trees to that. So a lot of times you'll see like a tree will have like a wound in it, a break in the bark, and you'll be able to see rotten wood inside that wound. So yeah, so definitely don't do that. I guess I was using that just as a point. So sometimes like on the long trail, you can see these trees where it's like, E.T. Hart's NS 1979 or something like that. And it's just sort of the way that beech bark grows.
Yeah. I always think of it like you wouldn't want someone to scratch your skin and make you have a scab. So don't do it to
Yeah,
a tree.
yeah, don't mess with trees.
Yeah.
Now, the one thing I would say is the exception to that rule is that taking a little bit of birch bark from a paper birch tree,
Yeah.
those sheets of bark, peeling off a piece of sheet within reason, taking a sheet from a tree is not going to hurt that white birch tree.
Yeah. That's good to know. Birch bark is so pretty. But
It's
then
amazing.
if
Yeah,
everyone took a ton of bark from them, that wouldn't be good either.
yeah, they need that.
Yeah. Cool. Thank you for that question. I think that was from Emily. So I saw another good one that I wanted to answer. I can't find the name of the person who asked it. Oh, Jessica. Jessica from Facebook. Are there any old growth forests in Vermont that would be interesting to check out?
So there's very few, almost none. Uh, there's some that are like probably technically old growth that are really high elevation. So like as you're going hiking up to the top of Camel Sump or Mount Mansfield, those forests are old growth, but they're not an example of old growth like where most of us live, like in these valleys and areas like that. And the problem is that almost all of those were clear cut in the 1800s, except for like very remote ones. There are scattered around pockets of old growth. In Chittenden County, the closest thing that I know of to old growth is at a place called Williams Woods in Charlotte. Williams Woods was probably has been logged, but it was never, there's parts of it that were never managed as pasture. And so in those areas, there's just like some huge trees. And one of the amazing things that I always say about old growth is that I try to manage forests like they manage themselves. And I'm really excited about like doing active management to make our forests, which are relatively young because of the clearing that happened in the 1800s, more like old growth forests actively. And so, but if you step into an old growth forest, everybody thinks it would look like this like beautiful park with these evenly spaced huge trees. But really it looks like really, really messy. So there'll be like, there's like dead trees on the ground and there's trees of all different sizes and ages and dead standing trees, which are all like really important parts of healthy forests, but not necessarily what we would associate with like a really good looking forest. But yeah, Williams Woods is a good example of that in Charlotte.
Cool. Williams Woods. Remember that.
Managed by the Nature Conservancy.
The Nature Conservancy manages it. Is that what you just
Yes.
said? Cool. Okay, we have some questions from some younger viewers.
Great.
Hannah from Facebook, age 3, wants to know if you have a favorite tree.
Yeah, I have two. So I have, and so if you ask, this is interesting. If you ask almost any forester that question, they will have an answer ready for you. So if you meet another forester, you should ask them as well. I have always liked hemlock, eastern hemlock, which is this amazing tree species. It's a conifer, so what we call like an evergreen tree, meaning that it just has needles instead of leaves, and it keeps its leaves all year round. Hemlock grows in these like dense forests, and they have these really tight canopies, and if you walk into a hemlock forest, you know it immediately because it gets like dark and quiet, and it just like feels really different. So I've always really liked hemlock, but I recently bought a piece of land in Bolton, which is a really good place for growing oak, red oak. And so now I've decided that red oak is my favorite deciduous tree species. So deciduous trees are the trees with leaves instead of needles that lose their leaves in the winter. So I have hemlock as my favorite conifer, and red oak is my favorite deciduous tree.
Cool. I love white birch, and I also love ginkgo trees, but I don't know if those are really up this way.
They're planted. Yeah, ginkgo's a really weird species of tree.
Cool.
There's all kinds of weird stuff about it. One weird thing is that they're the only tree in their whole family. So most trees, they have a family that's like all these different tree species, and then they have a genus, which is like sort of like their cousins, and then they have their species. And so there's sort of this, that's like their family tree. And ginkgo is the only tree in its genus and in its family.
Aww.
So it's just really, really weird and unique.
Oh, well, thanks for your question, Hannah. And thank you for that info, Ethan. Okay, Noah from Facebook, he is 9. Is there a reason for the whitewashed sections on sugar maples? So is that mold? What is that?
Wow, that's a great question. I don't know. I think that it is probably, there's a lot of lichens. So lichens are these just really cool different organisms. Some of them just exist on the bark of the tree. And it's probably what we would call like a commensalistic relationship. All that, it's a fancy word for saying that it's a relationship between two different species where one species benefits. So if that's a lichen, the lichen gets a place to live on the bark of the sugar maple tree, and the other species is unharmed. So the sugar maple isn't affected by it. It's just something that happens. And so I think that it's a lichen, but I'm not sure.
Cool. Great question from Noah. Okay, let's see more of the Facebook questions. Okay, Ethan wants to know, why do bears love nuts so much? The beech nuts, I think. Is that what we were talking about?
Yeah.
And then also, how do the bears help the trees by eating the nuts?
Wow, that's a great question too. So, in the fall, all of our native species of wildlife, as winter's coming, they have to figure out what they're going to do. And so different species deal with this in different ways. So like squirrels will like cache, which just means hide, acorns and nuts all over the place so that in the wintertime they can go and dig up their little acorn stash and eat them. Birds, most of our birds are what we call neotropical birds, which just means that they migrate all the way to the tropics. And then some of our native species like bear are going to basically sleep through the winter. And native species like deer are just going to be up and about and trying to stay warm and trying to stay alive during the wintertime. And so in the fall is this really important time when all these species of trees are producing these really, really healthy, nutrient-dense nuts that allows all of the, and also berries and stuff like that allow all of these species to basically make it through the winter, or in the case of birds, that allow them to get up enough energy to be able to migrate. So like late summer, birds are just like eating and eating and eating all these little berries so that they can then fly thousands of miles to where they spend their winter in the tropics. Bears are trying to eat as many beech nuts and acorns because they have a lot of fat in them. And by the end of the fall, bears can build up a lot of fat. And if you're a female bear, and this is like the most amazing thing, if you're a female bear, you give birth while you're sleeping, basically. So they're in like a version of hibernation called torpor. They give birth like in January or February, and then they continue to sleep while their babies are awake and nursing them for months, and they're not eating or drinking anything.
Wow.
And so they need to build up this incredible fat reserve just to be able to last through the wintertime. And in the case of female bears, they actually won't have their babies if they're under a certain weight, usually, because they know that they won't be able to survive it. And with deer, they're doing the same thing. So they're gorging themselves in acorns just so that they can have enough fat so that living through the winter when there's not very good food sources, they can make it. And bears just really love beech nuts. They just do. It's like a interesting relationship they have. The one last thing that I'll say about bears and beech trees is that bears will climb up those beech trees and they'll make what's called a bear nest, which is that they'll go up in the top of the beech tree, which is all loaded with beech nuts, sit in it, and then they'll take these branches that are loaded with beech nuts and break them into the center of the beech tree. So it looks like a huge it looks like a huge bird's nest that this bear is sitting in. And they'll like eat the nuts off the end of the twigs. And so that's the thing to look for. If you're in an area with a lot of beech, look for those bear nests.
Cool. Thanks for that great answer and for those great questions. Okay. Let me go through and see if there's any more from Facebook. Catherine from Facebook wants to know, do trees have distinctive root systems? Can you describe root systems? What's going on underground?
Wow. So trees, if you look at a tree, as you guys get to know these different species of trees, my tree identification teacher, this amazing guy named John Shane, who taught me at the University of Vermont, he would say that you're trying to get to a point where you're you're basically recognizing trees. There's that tree book that I told you about by Mark Mikolas, The Beginner's Guide to Recognizing Trees. The idea of being able to recognize trees is that, like, it's the same way that you would see your friend Steve, if he's like 300 feet away, you'd be like, oh, that's Steve. And if someone were like, well, why do you know that, Steve? You'd be like, oh, because that's how Steve walks, and that's how Steve, holds himself, and that's like, what Steve looks like, right? So you get to that place with trees, and all trees have above the ground, a unique way that their crown looks, a unique way that they branch. And so I would assume that those same traits, or different unique traits, also carry over to their root system. We know that we have some tree species like our oaks and hickory that have very deep tap roots. So they put a lot of energy in developing this single deep root system that goes right down into the ground, very deep. And we know that, also that there are species of trees which do better in areas with a higher water table that have a more shallow root system. The other thing I'll say about roots that are amazing is that increasingly we're learning that, again, forests are systems, and that looking, you sort of look at it above ground, you're like, there's all these different trees, but then there's all this amazing research about those root systems are actually connected, and they're connected. The roots themselves graft together, but then also there's these different species of fungi, like mushrooms, right, that have these incredibly complex and intricate webs that connect the different tree roots, and that actually share nutrients between the trees, between different species of trees, between different ages of trees. It's this incredibly amazing, important part of how forests grow. And so you can sort of think of the forest like as one big organism, in the same way that you can think about it as a bunch of sort of unique trees.
That is so awesome. It's just like the tip of the iceberg is what we are.
I could talk to you guys about forests all day long.
Yeah, cool. Okay. I think we have about 2 more questions.
Great.
Let's see. From Facebook, someone, Jessica, wants to know, I love how pine trees interact with the atmosphere to benefit themselves. Do other trees do the same?
I wonder what she means by that.
Yeah.
I know that there's also there's the influence of trees. So trees, it's what's called transpiring. They're basically sucking moisture out of the ground and putting it up in the air. And so they're actually to a certain degree, on a large scale, they're altering the humidity of the air, and they're even altering the weather to a certain respect, and participating in this sort of complex arrangement with the atmosphere. And they're also constantly they're sucking in carbon dioxide, right? And then they're holding onto that carbon and making it into wood, and then releasing oxygen, which is another interaction with the atmosphere. We also know that that trees communicate with each other via these airborne chemical signals. So if one side of the forest is getting defoliated by an insect, attacked by an insect, the other side of the forest sometimes will be at the same time receiving the message that the other side of the forest is getting attacked, and building up compounds in their leaves that are going to defend them against those insects, stuff like that.
Oh, okay, cool. Jessica followed up how they disperse gases into the atmosphere to scatter sunlight to reach lower leaves.
Yeah, I mean, yes. So they do that, and I feel like I can't. I'm not well read or well informed enough on that specific topic that I could talk about it in depth. But they do all kinds of interesting climatic stuff.
Cool.
Thanks, Jessica. I'm gonna read more about that so that I feel confident talking to you guys about it.
Nice. Yeah, keeping us on our toes. We were also wondering if you can kind of give a few identifiers, just really quick, of red oak.
Red oak. So, that was on one of my slides. I'm gonna just quickly share my screen. I'll just show you that slide. How about that?
Sounds like we have some big red oak fans in the event. They need to know.
I know. Those are my red oak people right there. This is what the bark looks like. So the bark is, as the bark of an oak tree gets bigger, it goes from looking like this. It will be shiny and what I call this dark gray, like a chrome gray. and it'll start to develop these reddish orangish cracks that run vertically up and down the bark, and you can kind of see those cracks here and here. As it gets older, those cracks or the area between those cracks will develop into these big, thick, flat ridges. And so people describe it as ski trail bark because it kind of looks like, if you look at the side of a mountain with ski trails on it, the way the trails sort of join together and then go apart again is the way that those ridges look like. I've also heard them look like sanded off ridges. So if you guys have, if you took like an ash tree's bark with those thin, intricate ridges and like sanded them down, it would sort of look like that. And the bark, when it's young like that, can be pretty shiny, and you'll still start to see those reddish orangish fissures, which is a really, really good trait for red oak. I say that oak leaves look like they're having a bad hair day. So they basically have all these pointy lobes, Each one ends in this little pointy tip. You can also remember it because some people remember it by thinking about red oak. Red is like fire, and that these lobes look like flames right here. And those lobes can also be pretty shiny. And then now, this isn't always the case, but they can also, every 2 or 3 years, they're going to make a lot of these bad boys, acorns. And we all know what acorns look like. And so sometimes if you're by an oak tree, you can kind of scuff around the oak tree if you're not sure and find acorns, and that'll tell you it's an oak tree.
Nice. Thank you for going back over that. And then we have one question here from Gail. She has questions about balsam firs.
Yeah.
Which I know wasn't in your slides, but maybe you can give a few identifiers just really quick. And she's saying that the trees might be causing witch's broom on her blueberry bush. Do you know what can be done about this?
I don't know. This has come up a couple different times recently for me. I don't know anything about witch's broom. So, I know what it is. It's basically a mutation in the tree that makes it mutate and make this big, what looks like a broom coming off the top of a branch or something like that. But I don't know enough about it to talk to you about it and the implications for blueberries and stuff like that, unfortunately. I can tell you about balsam fir because it's one of our most populous tree species. Here in Chittenden County, we basically only see it like on the tops of mountains and in people's old Christmas tree plantations where they planted Christmas trees and never harvested them. And so you get these dense growths of balsam fir. The bark of balsam fir is metallic. It's like gray, and it has all these like bluish grayish blotches on it. And then it'll also have these really cool pitch bubbles. So you'll see all these bubbles, these oval bubbles sticking out of the bark. And if you pop one, and popping one isn't going to hurt the tree, if you pop one, all of this pitch will come out. The pitch is antiseptic. So native people used to put it on wounds to keep them from getting infected. It's also, people used to use it for gluing lenses together on like microscopes and stuff like that, because it dries really clear, and people would actually take these sticks with tin cups on the ends of the sticks, and they would pop the blisters of the fir trees and collect all the pitch and sell it. It also, if you take a little teeny stick and you stick it into one of those pitch blisters, and then you put that stick in a puddle, it'll go around like a little motorboat, which is also really cool.
That's cool.
Yeah, and they have flat needles. They're shaped, they have this very specific shape. So they're shaped to this really, really pointy, steeple-like top. And their cones, they're the only conifer that has cones that instead of hanging off the branches are borne upright on the branches. So they're like standing on top of the branches. Cool.
That was a great question. Thank you for answering it, Ethan. I think that's all of our questions.
Great.
So I think we'll start to wrap up. I feel like I learned so much from you and from those pictures. Those were great pictures. I recently heard someone say that when you can identify trees, they become your friends. And I love that. And I think I'll take all the friends I can get right now because we're all kind of isolated. So Ethan, can you tell us some more references and resources maybe that you didn't mention before that are good for continued learning?
Yeah, so one thing that I would say is if you want to learn, if this stuff excites you and if you want to learn about it, there's a lot of organizations that we're all partnered together. We're like all on the same team, and we're all trying to give you more information and resources about forests and wildlife and how to manage forests well and how to, take care of our natural resources and stuff like that. So you can stay apprised of different learning opportunities by following these organizations like Vermont Coverts, Vermont Woodlands Association, the Vermont Land Trust, of course, Audubon Vermont, and sign up for their newsletter, their e-news, and follow them on social media. You can also, if you want, you can get on my mailing list, and I'll send you different notifications about forestry related events and tree identification related events that I'm doing, which is
Cool.
Email me at ethan.tapper@Vermont, and that's Vermont spelled out, .gov. And I'll put you on my list. And then just to recap that book, A Beginner's Guide to Recognizing Trees in the Northeast by Mark Mikolas, that book, Bark by Michael Wotek, are both really good places to start with identification. Yeah.
Cool.
And the last thing I would say is that I also have a YouTube channel, which has some other tree identification resources and videos on it. Just search for Chittenden County Forester on YouTube.
Cool. I'm putting that all in the chat box for anyone who is interested in taking advantage of that.
Thank you.
Cool. Thank you so much, Ethan. I had a great time and I learned so much. And now we're going to pass it off to Angie, who is on the communications team at VLT. She's going to go over some upcoming events and other details. So thank you.
Thanks, Catherine.
There we go. Yeah, thanks, guys. I definitely want to thank everyone who joined us on Zoom and Facebook. This was our first Facebook Live event, and we had so many questions coming in, and I'm so grateful to everyone who joined. It was really fun. And thank you to Catherine and Ethan, of course, who led this and did such a great job presenting it for all the beginners and, well, everyone in general. I know I'm a beginner. Growing up in a city, this is great information for me as I explore Vermont's woodlands, and it's really fun. If anyone has any questions or comments, we're happy for feedback. You can email me at angela@vlt.org. I so much appreciate feedback, and I want to direct folks to vlt.org if they want to look at more events. We have educational info, we have a recreation map up there, information on how to support local farms. At VLT, we are about conserving farmland and forests, protect them from development, and keep Vermont kind of the working landscape that it is, which is awesome. Jamie had asked if we give tours for all ages. I just wanted to address that really quick because we're so grateful for your interest, Jamie, and normally we do events and tours such as that. And again, you can see that sort of stuff on our website. At the moment, due to the pandemic, we're trying to move stuff online and keep people grounded and connected to nature, but eventually the in-person tours will resume, so stay in touch. And for everyone else, this is recorded. If you wanted to revisit it, it'll be on our website, it'll be on our YouTube channel. And I think that was everything I wanted to get through. So thank you again, and we hope you have a great afternoon.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah, thanks.
Bye.